I'm Vince Allen, and the name of this talk is Pixel Art on the Wall. We're going to talk about how to get pixels on a wall. We're also going to talk about how to render pixel art in a web browser and pixel art animation, and then how to output that to video. So I'm a software engineering manager at Spotify, and you can get in touch with me on Twitter, Vince Allen Vince. All the code for the demos that you're going to see can be found at this repo. And a quick note about the code, it just uses all vanilla JavaScript, HTML, CSS, and a DOM. There's no Flash, Canvas, Java, or other sort of malwares.
This commercial is based on a true story.
Hello? Tracy, no, we don't need a babysitter tonight. Thanks anyway.
After a family bought an Atari video game, they had no trouble getting babysitters.
Hello?
So despite what this TV commercial implies, playing video games did not lead me to spend more time with my parents. But it did give me my first glimpse at pixel art. So I spent hundreds, if not thousands of hours playing the Atari 2600. And this is some of the imagery that I was interacting with. You know, it's simple, and it's an abstraction of the real world, certainly an abstraction of the fantastic depictions that were on the cartridge's packaging. But given their simplicity, these images framed a world that I explored and escaped in day after day. This is the Atari 2600's color palette. There are 128 colors. It's quite beautiful. Compared to a modern console, the 2600 had limited technical capabilities. And I remember the first time I discovered a glitch in Atari's combat, and I could drive my tank outside the game space. And it reinforced this impression that I had that this game space was actually limitless. And like the tragic hero of Atari's bowling, I stood at the center of a vast universe with no audience to cheer my accomplishments. But this was the 70s, and there's a lot from the 70s that we've left behind. So before we look at creating pixel art now, I think it's worth asking, is pixel art just a cultural artifact that we reference purely for nostalgic reasons? So to find out, let's look at some modern pixel art 8-bit style. So this is Sword and Sorcery, released in 2011, and by 2013 it had sold 1.5 million copies. And if you're looking for an example of cinematic pixel art, you know, this is it. This is one of my favorite all-time games. This is Ridiculous Fishing. It won the iPhone Game of the Year last year. And it's a really interesting pixel art style because it just rotated the pixels like 90 degrees, 45, I don't know. Minecraft. I remember the first time I saw Minecraft and I was like, this is 3D pixel art. So Minecraft just recently announced they have over 100 million registered users. So pixel art games, they reach a massive global audience and they make up some of the most popular games we're playing today. But you can go outside and find pixel art. This was taken in New York's East Village in 2008. And I remember the first time I saw Anthony Gormley's work. His sculpture abstracts the human form in a way that reminds me of pixel art. And if you're thinking of designing an interior, Ixie.com will pixelate your uploaded artwork and send you the tiles to stick on the wall. So whether it's game art, street art, commercial art, or high art, I believe that pixel art is more popular today than it's ever been. So in 2008, I moved into a big Brooklyn apartment, and it had high ceilings and these big blank walls. And right around this time, I saw this poster, and I thought, I want this on the wall, about this size. I want it to be huge, you know? And you couldn't just go buy it. And I'd seen people do post-it mosaics before, and I thought, okay, that's the way I'm going to do this. So I wrote a script that just matched the colors in this color palette to the available colors in post-it notes. That's what it looks like. And this is it in my kitchen. You guys remember this cover? So this is a 10-foot Megan Fox in Post-it notes. So it's 7.5 feet wide by 10 feet high, and we saved on some pixel or Post-its because it was on the black walls at one end of the apartment. My roommates are actually getting a little irritated with me at this point. And you know, the thing is, Post-it art is hard. You know, you're up and down a ladder, and Post-its tend to fall off, and it's kind of a pain. So I started doing some digital stuff, and I still really liked the big blocky style. This is from a game that I was working on. This is me imitating the Batman comic cover. But all these images were static, and I wanted them to move. And being a JavaScript developer, I really wanted them to move in a web browser. So the first approach I took really built off of what I learned by sticking Post-it notes on a wall. So these Post-it notes are just giant pixels, and all they have is an X and Y location, a color, and a scale. So that's 4 properties. It's pretty simple, and any modern web browser should be able to handle that. And I called the first solution Big Block Framework. And it tackled the problem really literally. So the browser window was the wall, and it was divided into a grid of 8 by 8 pixel squares. And I used HTML and div elements to represent the pixels. So it turns out that one option to animate and to render would be just to have an animation loop and hit every div's style properties and just update them as needed, right? A faster way is actually, because this is a finite universe, right? It's a grid, and it has a color palette. We know every position, and we know every color that could ever happen. It's just pre-calculate all that and generate a bunch of CSS, and then in the animation loop, we're just going to change the class names. And actually, it's several times faster. Probably not the most conventional way to go about something, but let's take a look. This is also around the time that, it was 2010, and iPhone had just kind of announced that it's not going to allow Flash on an iPhone. And I thought, oh cool, I'll make a site called thisisnotflash.com. And I was just doing things like this. So this is a bunch of divs acting like a fireplace. And all I'm doing here is just switching out the class names really fast, and the divs are just being positioned. And I was doing little particle effects, things like that. And, you know, just like little simulations. So these are pretty fun. I remember the first time I saw Reggie Watts perform, and I thought, oh, you know, he would make a great pixel art character. He's kind of recognizable. I'll do a little dance there, I guess. There's a couple of, well, there's a huge issue with this approach. So if you're only concerned with a really small area, then I guess this is fine. But even at this size, there's thousands of styles you have to pre-calculate. If you want to do something in a large format, it's not feasible. There's just way too many styles, and you run out of memory, and there's way too many divs to deal with, and so on. So the root of this problem was that I was creating a one-to-one relationship with the pixels and the divs, and I needed a solution that didn't depend on the DOM. So I created something I call the bit shadow machine. And the solution here still uses a grid of 8 by 8 pixel squares. And it actually does use one DOM element, and we position it at the top left, but we give it a width and height of 0. So now it's hidden, okay? What's really cool about what I believe is the browser's true equivalent to a Post-it note, which is the CSS box shadow, is that box shadows can appear if their parent has no scale. And so all I'm doing here is giving this box shadow an X and Y offset and giving it a 4-pixel spread, so it spreads out in all directions in 4 pixels. So now I've got it a little 8 by 8 pixel. What's also cool about box shadows is that you can have a lot of them, which is kind of what we need, right? And they can have a 2D location relative to the parent. They can have a blur value, which is really interesting. They have a scale, which is their spread. And you can display color either in RGB or in HSL, hue, saturation, luminosity, lightness, I don't know. And they also have an opacity you can use through the alpha property of the color. So then all I need to do is just update these box shadows as needed, right? So let's take a look at that. So this is a really simple example. And I'm going to open up the DevTools so you can see what I'm talking about. So I just have a container here to center what is the world, right? You can see this thing has no scale, right? Width and height is 0, but it does have a box shadow. It just happens that it positions the box shadow right in the middle with its X and Y offset. So that's kind of cool, kind of boring. What if we get it to move, right? So now we have the world running a gravity simulation, and if we look at our world, sure enough, this guy's X offset is updating, and we can see him peak up right there. So the big payoff of this thing, though, was that we could do many more objects in a composition than the previous solution. So here is 1,000 box shadows, all animating at 60 frames per second. So that's a little better. And remember I talked about blur, right? So we get this nice blur effect if we map the velocity of these objects to their blur values, so that as they speed up, they get blurrier. So this is just a really cheap motion blur effect that I get with pure CSS. So how many box shadows can you have? I was thinking about this when I was reading Keith Peters' book. He wrote a book called Playing with Chaos, and it's written for JavaScript developers who are interested in playing with algorithms that generate fractals and chaotic patterns. And so I wrote a fractal generator, and we'll get let's get a cool pattern. Here we go. We zoom in on this, you can see these are just a bunch of box shadows. But how many box shadows? Well, it's 29,525. So almost 30,000 box shadows, right? That's a lot of box shadows. I've never used that many box shadows before. We can also play with box shadow galaxies in these chaotic patterns and do kind of stuff that you wouldn't necessarily expect. All right, but we came here for pixel art. So to render, if I can do this, I can render pixel art, and it comes down to the pixel art is cats, and all I have to do to render the shape is just give the framework a list of positions and colors and scale. So if I want to do something like this, I've got, I think, 12 or so frames here, and I just need to describe them. What would be really kind of a pain would kind of manually do this and go in and select the color and get its offset and everything. So I wrote a tool I call it Bit Shadow Press, and I can take files that I create in Photoshop, and I'm using the file system API in Chrome, and I'm loading them locally and then interrogating the graphic and generating all the information I need. And then I can output some JSON. So here's my kitty. I can play with the delay, so we're going to run. I have to do this. Anyway. And here's all the information I need, and I can pass it off. And I have cats, mini cats. How many box shadows are there? Almost 400. We could add more. I have this idea for an animation about a little box of milk that has legs. He lives on a dairy farm, and this is him running away from home. So there's a lot of possibilities here. And one thing that we haven't looked at is the use of the HSL color. So going back to simulations, so these objects are following a hidden target, and they're observing a flocking behavior. And it's kind of subtle, but when they're speeding up, they're losing saturation, and they're also gaining blur. So we're kind of throwing everything in for this. And because I have HSL, I can play around with different cues and so on, so that's kind of fun. But I really wanted to get at this whole blur thing because I thought it was interesting. Whoops. So this is whatever box is going to have 150 or 130. So you can tell that I'm trying to really amp up the blur here. When I saw this, I thought, this kind of looks like video. Like I'm not thinking about CSS anymore, and I really wanted to figure out a way to project this in a large format. So I'll tell you how I did that. I used Photoshop, and I used Node. With the 14.1 version of Photoshop, you get something called Adobe Generator. And Adobe Generator, it lets you automate tasks in Photoshop using Node. So you can write Photoshop plugins using JavaScript, and that's really interesting. I wrote a Node app that would run my simulations and collect all the data for every frame. So it's not a lot of data, right? It's just 4 properties for every object. And I saved it all, and then I wrote a plugin that would run under Generator and tell Photoshop to reconstruct every frame at HD resolution and use Photoshop filters. And one of the important ones was motion blur for me, and I could pass the angle that the objects were traveling and get a true motion blur, something that actually is blurring in the direction that they're traveling. And then when it's done, I get a bunch of frames. I can compile the HD video. So let's take a look at one of these. So this is the same simulation, but now we're having true motion blur, and because I'm not bounded by the browser's limitations, I can add many more objects to this. This was the other one. Jameson is an artist trying to raise money to build a sculpture garden in Harlem, New York, made entirely of sugar cubes. I think this is really cool. It's kind of like an edible Minecraft. But it had me thinking, what is a pixel? And for me, a pixel is the building block of our imagination. And a single unit represents possibility and opportunity. So I see a single pixel and I have this irresistible urge to add more. And I hope you feel that way too. I didn't go into any code, but if you're interested, you can find all the code for those demos at these repos. All right, thanks.